Hello, people, and thank you for joining me and my friends on the Game Files podcast. My name is Matthew, and I will be hosting discussions on all things dice throwing, button mashing, page turning, and screen viewing, from the past, present, and future of those things that occupy our spare time. Today, again, I have with me Radis.
Hello, hello.
And Marty, Marianne, whatever we call him today. So
let's go with Mad Marianne or
Mad Marianne. I like it. Wow. Something just happened here. Something happened really well. So
we think new podcast discussion.
Exactly. So today we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy. It's a title that's been going on since the 80s that we know of, probably before in somebody else's head. And it's definitely had a
87.
87. Well, it's had a lot of influence on our lives, I would say. I think I can blanket statement that. And it is one of those games that each edition of it kind of transcends itself and reinvents itself, and it's just kind of a neat idea. So we'll kind of get started just talking about our first memories of the franchise. So we'll start off with you, Marty. What is your first memory of Final Fantasy?
Well, my first memories of Final Fantasy, actually I'm going to kind of backtrack it, because I had a very close association between the game Dragon Warrior on the original NES, and I kind of considered like Final Fantasy like the next leap up. As far as when I got into Final Fantasy, I mean, anytime you saw a new game, it was exciting, and I thought it was kind of like an updated version of Dragon Warrior, like I said. I didn't really have too much in-depth with Final Fantasy at first. It took a couple of goes later on, but when Nintendo Power came out with their strategy guide for that particular game, that's when it really kind of developed some meaning for me. So I'll just kind of start there.
Nice. How about you, Radis? What got you into it?
Looking for a new style video game with a fairly recently purchased Super NES. Trying to get away from, the traditional sports games, racing games, fighting games, and I just happened to stumble across this little box that said Final Fantasy III, Final Fantasy VI in Japan for the people listening at home. Picked it up not really knowing what I was getting into, and I was like, oh, RPGs? Like, we'll check it out. Put it into the old Super Nintendo there, and within 40 minutes I was hooked. I was like, yeah, this is going to eat my life for the next 6 months. And then living across the street from Mad Marty down there, playing that game in my house and over his house and just talking about characters and what we've done differently, and then just the ability to name the main characters I thought was just kind of cool. So you didn't get stuck to this character. You could actually then relate them to other friends or family members.
Quick question for you, Radis. I honestly, after all these years, I've never really noticed that. Final Fantasy III for the SNES was your first exposure to the franchise?
Yeah. NES didn't really... It was a family gift, so we played more, Mario, stuff that my sister could play or my dad would play. So I didn't really get a whole lot of just the single-player games. So it just didn't really hook me into any of those kind of games. Plus, that age, I was, still spent a lot of time outside. So it really wasn't until I got a little bit older, and then the Super NES came out, and that was mine. I bought it. So I started looking into games that were one player or, stuff that wasn't arcadey. I spent a lot of times in arcade. So the NES stuff was like, oh, I can sit down and play for 10, 15 minutes as a loop and then go outside, go play basketball, or, help my parents around the house so I don't get in trouble. NES, when I started buying games, it's like, oh, this is a 2-hour game. Lo and behold, oh, this is a 160-hour game. So it wasn't until the Super NES.
Oh, yeah. That's actually really interesting to me because, I don't think of it because with us all being relatively the same age, it's like, wow, the third one U.S. anyways.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I just want to toss in one more side note.
Yeah, go ahead.
Radis was living across the street from me at the time. It is also worthy to know because Radis used to get like some pretty cool games. I remember the first time he got Madden 95. That was pretty special. I remember the time he got Killer Instinct. And I remember when The Empire Strikes Back, and that was like
Super Empire Strikes Back.
Super.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
And that was like the cutting edge game for the SNES back in those days. It was hailed as the greatest game ever made at the time. And I remember him going into waiting for Return of the Jedi, which was kind of meh by comparison.
Comparison, it was, yeah.
Right. Oh, yeah.
But what made Final Fantasy III stick out, and that being the Final Fantasy VI for you hardcore people out there, Final Fantasy III for the SNES was the one game that Radis promised he would never lend out.
Still have it. It's still downstairs.
Yeah. It's still true.
That's awesome. So that is pretty awesome. So my first experience with Final Fantasy is actually at my neighbor Scotty's house. Now, it's not the Scott you guys know. He got a Nintendo before I did. I actually didn't get one until, like 7-8 years after they were out, right ever when Super Nintendo was coming out is when I actually got my Nintendo. But it's at Scotty's house, spent the night, and he's like, I've got this game called Final Fantasy. I'm like, cool, let's pop it in. Couldn't get anywhere. Couldn't beat anything. Couldn't do anything. It was god-awful. So later on in life at Mad Marty's house, I played it again, or I was watching him play it, and figured out that, you had weapons you could equip and armor that you could equip. So I pretty much was an idiot as far as that game goes, but I didn't have a game guide. I didn't have anything. It was just trying to play it. I was really excited about it because I like the idea of creating your own team, naming them, doing your thing. But yeah, that was a bad experience. However, playing it over at Marty's house, that was a totally different situation. That was so much fun because we actually, I shouldn't say I did not play it. I watched him play it, but that was back in the day when you would do that. But that is my first experience with the franchise, which to this day I still love that game. I could still play the original. I probably the updated one because it's a little more streamlined, but yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Oh no, put in that NES.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so just kind of going off of that. So obviously there's been, we could say 15 games, but there's really sequel to games and this and that and the other thing. So just in general, like if you had to name off your top 3 Final Fantasies, what would they be? Go with you, Marty.
Well, I haven't played the entire franchise, so I'm just going to kind of preface with that. However, what I will tell you is the games that I consider the greatest leaps. Now, there are some debatable points on there that it's kind of a toss-up, but if you put a gun to my head, the biggest leaps that I've always considered, Final Fantasy 3/6 for the SNES, and Final Fantasy VII, which kind of took me off guard. We'll talk about that later. And then Final Fantasy Tactics, which was a real gem. And I would still, to this very day, recommend that to anybody. I mean, it's kind of like in its own category in the Final Fantasy franchise. But Tactics is a beast of the game. Actually, it's probably my favorite in the franchise, I have to admit. Probably my favorite overall. I know I just kind of praised Final Fantasy 3, but now I think about it, I'm going to go with Tactics. It's my personal favorite.
Nice. What do you got, Radis?
Yeah, I've not, again, like Marty, I haven't played all of them. I've played a lot of them. I'm just looking at a list here. I think I'm only missing 1 or 2 from the mainline that I haven't played. Mostly because there's so many of them were Japanese-only releases, and then they got U.S. releases, but they're like on the DS or the PSP or some handheld that I don't own. Obviously, 3, being the first one I ever played, is definitely one of my all-time favorites. I think that game, story-wise, still holds up today in comparison to Final Fantasy 15 or any of these other mega, like Last of Us. There's just, you get hooked on those characters in Final Fantasy 3, I think, in a way that a lot of video games lose. And the characters are unique. I enjoyed Final Fantasy IX. And I want to make sure that's the right one.
That's the right one, because it was kind of a throwback.
Yeah, it's got that fantasy feel. It doesn't try to reinvent the wheel, but it does enough stuff to where it's fresh and doesn't feel like, it's the same game, same systems. The third one, I'm kind of mixed. Everyone wants me to throw Final Fantasy VII in there. I think it's a great game. I think it's worth playing, but my problems with it are where 3 shines with the characters. I think 7's characters kind of become diluted. I think the remake is doing a lot better job of fleshing out the characters, but in the original one, you can spend 100 hours in that game, take your 3 characters you've never touched, throw the materia on them and beat the final boss in 3 minutes. That kind of just makes all the characters in my mind pointless. 10, I thought, like I said, I think I would probably put 10 in there over 7 just because, again, you feel the characters. They introduce the sphere grid and all of that, so it gives you a lot more control over the characters. There's some game-breaking mechanics in there once you've played it a little bit and you understand numbers in the game. But I thought, again, that your characters and the story was done really, really well, and they throw a few pretty big twists about halfway through that game that you thought the game was going one way, and it just takes this left turn, and you're just kind of thrown for a loop, which, again, I think 3 does really well, 10 does. 9 does it a little bit, but not as much. So those would be...
Although 9 gets real. Like, it's so kiddish in the beginning, but in the end, it gets hardcore.
And I think that's what hurt it, is a lot of people got into that first hour, and it's like, oh, this feels like it's dumbed down on. I was like, yeah, it's not. And you really get into that story, and you know, one of your main characters is a bumbling idiot at the beginning of the game, and he has to deal with that, and he knows it, and he's trying to fix it, and like it's his responsibility to protect these people. And you see this huge emotional arc on. It's not even the main character; it's a side, one of the 3 side characters.
Yeah. Although in the end, I just liked everybody in that game for the most part, even the silly ones, because it was a fantasy game. Like
and spoilers, I felt bad, and again, the Black Mage.
Oh,
when he starts seeing the other Black Mages, you're like, oh, that's heartbreaking. Just to see what he goes through.
Or this,
no spoilers.
Yeah, again, this is going to be. Well, here's the thing: this whole thing's going to be spoilerific, and that's fine. So
I don't mind spoiling little things, but stuff like that.
Oh no, man! There's some brutal side, man.
If we're talking about games that have been out for a couple decades, I think we don't have to worry about.
We don't have to worry about spoiling them.
Well, I don't mind spoiling major things, but I don't know, the little things that I think are like heart shrugs that just makes you go, oh, for like 30, 40 seconds, and then you get back in the story. Those I don't want to really spoil.
I'm just going to say
all the bosses and all. I don't care. But.
I'm going to just kind of throw this in there for Final Fantasy IX. The scene where I'm just going to say they are falling. Oh my gosh, dude! I was dying inside.
Yeah,
that was well done.
Too, Matthew. What's your top 3?
Well, that's a good question. I would say that my number 1 is. It still goes to 3 because 3 was just fantastic. Characters were great. Almost every single character had a fantastic backstory. They related well with each other. Everybody, it makes sense that their goals would align and they would basically team up and go against the big bad, which Kefka was. You just hated him so much. Every time you heard that laugh, you just cringe. Ugh.
Radis used to call him Ant Boy.
Oh, yeah. He looked like an ant.
Nice.
Its head, the way it was shaped, was an ant shape.
Yeah. And so, that by far is my number 1. Number 2, see, for me, that's a tough one. For nostalgic reasons, I would probably say the original. I could still play it to this day. Even though I haven't played it in a little while, I was in the middle of the White Mage Challenge, which is not a good idea. Don't do it.
No.
I'm still doing it anyways, like an hour at a time every month or so. It's terrible. It's god awful, but it's one of those things. And then as far as my third, and that's where the toss up comes in, because again, I'm Final Fantasy VII. The music was amazing. The bad guy was fantastic. I loved it. Some of the side characters are great, but I am going to have to kind of agree that the main characters were kind of wishy washy. Man, that's tough because I really love that game. But I would probably say that Final Fantasy X, gosh, it's weird because things have changed over the years, but I'd say Final Fantasy X is probably my third favorite because of the sphere grid, because it was so dynamic, and it made the game so much fun, and pretty much all of the characters were well flushed out, and for some of the ending scenarios, like that kind of hurt. It kind of hurt real bad when you knew what was going to happen. So. Yeah, it was it was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. And I mean, the follow-ups I played a little bit, but I never finished them. It just never got to me as far as that goes. But yeah, they were those are my 3 favorites. I mean, honorable mentions, obviously 9, because since I was talking about, I did like 9 a lot. 7 obviously is an honorable mention. Pretty much most of them are some kind of honorable mention, except for 8.
Yeah, there's only 1 or 2 that we're going to bash on. 8.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, speaking of eight, because
let's just tear this Band-Aid off.
yeah, let's
Yeah.
go here. For the listeners out there, I don't think any of the three of us liked Final Fantasy VIII. To this very day, I still cannot figure out why the gaming community just loved that game. It's still hailed as like one of the better ones of the franchise in a lot of places that I've read. And I just don't get it. You know, I mean, it had some nice elements to it, and they really tried with the upgrade of the graphics on that one, but it felt stiff as a board. And the combat system just was not fun for me.
No.
And I got lost. I got lost at the orphanage and never could pick up the game again.
Yeah, it's like
what killed it for me.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
You first.
Okay, to say because your wife loves this game, but
I know she
what
does.
What got me was every Final Fantasy has that traditional growth arc. You start off, you're weak, you've got all your beginning equipment, you go out and you're killing rabbits pretty much while you're working through the story as you level to get better equipment. Final Fantasy VIII, I think I played for 4 hours, and I was still killing rabbits that were taking 20 minutes to fight, that I'd have to go through summons to kill it. Every summon, you had to watch the entire cutscene, which could be 30 to 45 seconds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but now think about it. You're playing a video game, sitting there for 45 seconds, every 2 minutes, not doing anything, trying to kill some of the weakest stuff. Because if you didn't go and farm material to increase your weapon strength, magic was the only thing you had. Your weapons would hit for 1 or 2 points. Someone has 200 hit points, you're like, oh, 1 or 2 points. It's like, yeah, but then it turns around and hits your character for 50 out of your 100 hit points, so you're going to blow all of your healing every fight. And for me, that just kind of, there wasn't an intuitive way for the system to go, okay, here's the growth arc. But to follow that arc, you need to go over here and get ore or whatever material was, so that your base level 1 weapon was going to be bumped up the same as your character level, so that you can go kill that rabbit with one single sword strike.
And I totally missed that mechanic in Final Fantasy VIII. I knew about it years later, but
same way I did it.
By then, the ship already sailed.
Well, and it's one of those things, like when you start a game, for pretty much all of the Final Fantasies, you start a game, and one of the first enemies you go against, we'll say it's an imp, right? So the imp comes out when you first fight it, because it's your first fight. Yeah, it takes you a couple minutes. All your guys have to attack. It's not terribly easy. Come back 25 levels later, you should one-shot everything, because it's an imp. Yep. But in that game, in Final Fantasy VIII, man, we're turning this into a rag for Final Fantasy VIII. But anyways, in that game, you fight an imp at level 1, takes forever. Then you fight it at level 25, takes forever, because they grow with you. That makes no sense.
They did the same thing in Final Fantasy, is it 11 online?
Oh,
once you hit level 10, you pretty much could not solo. Obviously, it's online. And
I got to level 13 by myself and then quit the entire game.
Well, you had to, because, you could still level past 10, but every bit of content was group content.
Yeah.
And we'd also get to the point where the stuff that you were farming is no longer farmable, because it jumped up to the next tier and started becoming 2-man content, 3-man content, just fighting the stuff outside the city.
Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of the Final Fantasy MMOs, I'll have to admit I didn't give them much of a chance. But by then I was already into Star Wars Galaxies, which then we switched over to World of Warcraft. And at that point, it just didn't compete with me.
No, it wasn't even a thing. I mean, I played it because it was Final Fantasy. I think I played it for 2 months, and it wasn't like I played 8 hours a day every day, anything like that. But it was, I was hoping it'd be way more fun than it was, and it just wasn't. But yeah, Final Fantasy VIII, big thumbs down. My wife will disagree; she loves it, so good for you. But
yeah, I kind of thought about that. She was on here, so to defend it.
Yeah, and lastly, though, this is actually kind of this is what really ruined it for me, in some form or another. So I remember watching the advertisement for it, and I got really excited about it because 7. I like 7 a lot. This game was coming out, and then I even remember watching the intro where like the graphics were fantastic, and what was her name? Quistis, I think it was, with the whip. And I'm like, dang, she's going to be smoking some people. And then it was just awful. Like, everybody was emo, although that is kind of stereotypical now for these games. But everybody was emo, and it was like playing High School Musical without the music, I guess. I don't know. It was terrible. So,
I have a hard time disagreeing with you on that. So,
what's that?
But yeah, the character personalities just did not work for me. There were several plot points, like when Irvine couldn't take the shot all of a sudden.
Yeah.
The personalities just didn't work for me.
Yeah.
But like some of the other characters did in the past. Even going back to Final Fantasy II for the SNES, you had some very potent personalities even back in that game. But it just seemed a little too wishy-washy. But it's just my 2 cents.
No, that's okay. And I'm totally okay with that, because I think, maybe we agree too much. Maybe I should have brought my wife on and just had her defend it for 5 seconds.
I want people out there listening to understand we are bashing on 8, but we're saying that we did not have a good experience.
If you like it, good for you.
Tammy loved it. I know she was the first person I know who actually spent time and beat it with going all the way through. And I think, if I remember correctly, she did have a guide towards the end, just so she didn't miss some stuff. But I know
she was always a guide. Yeah, she was always a guide person. So, and she wants to play it again at some point. I tell her, go ahead.
She really loved it. And I know we always get a bad look from her when we bash it, because I think that's her favorite. So there are people out there like it. And I have a buddy that's one of his favorites, because he liked the characters. He likes the combat, but it's because he was able to go out and do that hour grinding, keep his weapons ahead of that combat growth curve. So that when he would fight stuff, it was attack, move on to the next thing, instead of attack, heal, summon, and sit there.
Yeah, sit there for every single one.
Attack, heal, summon. Wait. Oh, now the one chocobo or whatever is dead. All right, move on. And get 3 experience for that.
Yeah,
so you don't even really go up that much.
And just as kind of a caveat to all that, just so the listeners know, you can like whatever you like. I'm not going to fault you for it. I just don't personally like that game. So that's
why I say we're not saying that, if you play that game and liked it, you have no taste. You just have different tastes in that particular game.
Absolutely.
The nice thing about Final Fantasy is between the 17 or 18 main plus all the other ones, there's enough out there where if you don't like 8 or if you didn't like 7, you can play 9. Plays enough different. It's a completely different story, completely different characters. You can go and play, 12 again. So you can find 1 or 2 games in there. As long as you like the style of RPG and that kind of progression, just because you don't like the characters in one game does not immediately mean that you're going to hate the entire series. Unlike if you don't like the gameplay of a Mario, you're probably not going to be able to play any Mario game, because it's the same game loop in 99% of all those games. So I think that's really where Final Fantasy stands out against a lot of games. Even like the Dragon Warrior series and all that, they're out there. They're still putting out games.
I think there's one coming out soon, or just came out. Something like that.
I think so.
One other nice little side note with the Final Fantasies too is how there was, up until recent years, there was no continuity between, each reiteration. And I remember my buddy Hatavio really liked Final Fantasy III for the SNES also. He's like, well, I'd really like to see a sequel where, Shadow's got a new getup or something like that. I was like, don't count on it.
Oh, yeah, never.
No, and
at that
I'm
time.
glad they've done that. Yeah.
Well,
X2, I have X2, and I played up to the first boss. Lost interest in, again, because of the combat system. And some of the characters that they had spent the build up in the first one, they kind of, I thought, degraded a little bit in the second one to make them a little more J-pop-ish.
For sure.
So,
the entire so, absolutely, because the entire first sequence is essentially,
it's a rock concert.
It's a rock
with one of the 2 main characters of X being a lead singer of her own J-pop,
and then it turning into Charlie's Angels.
Yeah,
with poses and everything.
Everyone's like, "Oh, don't play it." And I was like, "No, I don't have a problem with that. I'll play a game with all girl power as long as it's a good story and the combat's good." Was good. It was weird that the whole combat was based on changing outfits. Yeah. But again, it hit that point. get your first ultimate outfit, go up against the first boss. Like, hey, here's your ultimate outfit for one of your characters. Here's the first boss. I one-shot him with this ultimate outfit. So it's like, makes everything else that I've got in my arsenal useless. It's kind of the Final Fantasy III double cast, one MP, ultimate, everything's dead. Why do I cast anything else?
Yeah.
Why do I even throw a sword?
Getting that economizer and gem box going, huh?
Yeah. Oh, every character.
I will throw this out there though. With X2, at some point I'll probably go back and watch a playthrough or like watch the cutscenes of it because I am curious to know how that ends. I actually do not know. I never researched that.
Yeah, I thought about going back and playing it and just force myself to never use an alternate outfit. Be like, all right, we're just going to. It's kind of the don't use Knights of the Round in Final Fantasy VII. Don't use the one MP Ultima Final Fantasy. Just kind of take the limit breaks out of Final Fantasy.
Make it a challenge.
10. Yeah.
Without having guide help though, going for Knights of the Round for Final Fantasy VII was literally a day-long endeavor.
I never had it.
Never had it either, but then again, I
had
never beat it.
The master
that's
one
a
they
story
gave
to
me for
tell.
free, but I never raised the gold Chocobo race. So I never did that.
Well, in the age of internet, you can look up a nice guide on your cell phone, and
It's true.
It took a full long day endeavor and just made it a few hours for me in terms of chocobo breeding, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I remember just doing the greens and stuff. You had to buy the greens and feed the chocobos, and you ran out of gill. So in throwing the races, it was a long endeavor. But the whole completionist aspect of my gameplay just kind of demanded it at the time. So
what was your most heartbreaking moment playing a Final Fantasy game?
Why don't you start with that, Raidus?
Most heartbreaking. I don't know. That's rough. There's the obvious one that everyone listening to this within Final Fantasy is going to say, but I don't know if I found that one the most heartbreaking.
That one was a surprise. I'll give you that.
Which one is that?
Eris.
Oh, Eris in 7. If anyone's listening to no Final Fantasy, say heartbreak, because that was so just, and even the game itself sets you up to fail. And it's like, oh, nope, you might be able to, and you can remember just racking that controller trying to get Cloud to move. And he would move a little bit, it's like, oh, maybe I'm doing it just wrong. I don't, that one hit me, but didn't hit me that hard. I really think it was all the way going back to 3, just like every time the game sets you up to where you think you're going to win and something good's going to happen, Kefka kind of showed up and screws over every single one of your characters in a different way. Whether it was watching Cyan have to deal with the fact that his entire castle has been poisoned by something that he could have stopped, or the brothers at the beginning of the game having to almost wipe out their entire castle to save themselves from being attacked. I just think that just the pure hatred for Kefka by the end of that game is probably my most emotional. But for just sometimes it jumps out if I not having like a couple days to think about that.
My memory is far more petty.
What's that?
Of course.
Well, in Final Fantasy II for the NES, I forgot what the number was for the actual series. It's the one with Cecil and Kane and Yang. And
The Dragoon.
Yeah, that's 2.
Maybe it was 4 or no, maybe it was 5 in the Japanese numbering system. But anyways, there was the character Kane in there winds up leaving your party several times throughout the course of the game. And there was one dungeon, it was called the Sealed Cave. And this didn't even happen to me. My brother was playing at the time. My older brother was playing. And he totally had him decked out in diamond armor. And he had just beaten the Sealed Cave dungeon. He beat the boss, and he was getting ready to exit. And as he's getting to the exit, the big bad, who was Gomez, takes possession of him again, or mind controls him again, and he leaves the party. but he takes all the equipment with him.
That's brutal.
It literally was like his entire treasure, like gold treasury investment, was into this guy. He like stopped at a village like right before the dungeon. Got this cutting edge armor, had him completely decked out in diamond armor, and like he walks out the door. And yeah, I was like, ooh. Needless to say, once you play through the game once, you know when to strip those party members.
Yep. Shadow does the same thing. There's another one where there's a couple that does that, and they took materia and magic with him, and it's like, oh, come back.
That's brutal. That's awful. Actually, I didn't know that one.
When Yuppie runs off with the materia at Wu Tai in Final Fantasy VII, that was another pisser too.
When what happened at Wutai?
The character Yuffie like takes all your materia and comes off with it. So
yeah, when you get robbed, and you have to chase her down.
Because by then you're accustomed to materia, and now all of a sudden you gotta walk like a mile without it. Kind of sucked.
That's funny. So my most brutal moment ever was I was playing Final Fantasy VII, and Jeff's gonna know where this is going. So I was playing Final Fantasy VII, and I got all the way. I was working at the time, but I got all the way, basically, to the battle right before the final Sephiroth battle. And I saved the game, and in my head, I'm like, okay, this weekend I'm going to knock this out. This is going to be awesome. It's going to be great. Well, it was Christmas weekend at the time, or it was like right around Christmas. So go to work, do my thing, don't play for a couple of days. And Christmas comes, and my Uncle Andy gets a game for the PlayStation, which, for the record, he didn't even have a PlayStation. But it was the Spice Girls game, because he had a thing for Jerry Halliwell. Probably still does. I don't know. That being said, we were all at my house, and he was like, hey, can I play this on your PlayStation? I said, sure. So he goes downstairs, and it won't play because you need save space. So he deleted my Final Fantasy account, save file, whatever. And my next closest one was like 5 or 7 hours into the game. So I've never beat Final Fantasy VII to this day. Now, Marty came over, or I came over to his house and finally showed it to me because I was there. But I never beat it because of that. And yes, I'm still bitter, Uncle Andy. And I hope you're listening to this because you owe me like a 30-hour save file. You better get cracking on it right now. I'm done with that. That's brutal.
All right. Well, I didn't know we were going that route, so I have a story on that. But what about for an actual story point that was emotional?
Well, we kind of alluded to it earlier. I mean, because again, we keep talking about the obvious one, but I would say in Final Fantasy IX, when all of the black mages were falling out of the airship, and and then you see the aftermath of just their basically their robes. There weren't really bodies in there anymore, but their robes just all over the ground, and that was absolutely brutal. Now, later on in the game, you find out not all of them died, which was good, but it was still just an awful, awful scene for a game that up until that point was kind of, I mean, it was silly at times, and I mean, it kind of brought back the old school kid aspect of it. Yeah. I would let, well, I don't know about my 6-year-old, but I'd let her play it in a couple of years and be fine with it. But then you get to that point and it's like, wait a minute, that's not okay. And I mean, I was in my 20s at the time, so pretty brutal scene. So that's probably my most heartbreaking scene. I remember just watching it, and I was playing it right next to my wife, and we were both watching it like, what is happening? This isn't okay. This isn't okay.
Yeah.
Whenever
Vivi is the name of the character.
What's that?
Vivi is the name of the character.
The Black Mage? Well, I always called him Bad Mofo, so I had no idea what his real name was to this day.
Kind of going back to emotional, gut-wrenching moments in Final Fantasy, I mean, going into tactics, I mean, that game is loaded with plot points that's just gut-wrenching, That is not a happy story. Final Fantasy Tactics.
No, I've watched some of it with you when you were playing it back in the day. It was brutal at times.
Yeah, it's. I mean, you're dealing with conspiracies and cover-ups, and
assassinations.
Vilifying the main character. It's such a nasty, or seeing like what should be a very noble institution get disintegrated in that game. It was a pretty nasty thing to watch. How they treat the main character. It's like the epitome of unsung hero throughout the course of the game. And the ending, it took me several years to really understand what happened at the ending of Final Fantasy Tactics, and because I don't know how much I want to talk about it, but it just
okay, you can cry.
There's a lot of political intrigue in Tactics, which is very different from a lot of the other Final Fantasies that play out there. So that's just my take on the emotional aspect of Final Fantasy. I felt very empty at the end of Tactics.
I felt empty inside.
Yeah, I can see that.
That's pretty cool. So, we've obviously have all these experiences playing the different games, some of them together, some of them, on our own. One of we alluded to this in the previous podcast about, Final Fantasy having effects on our creativity as well with the game, as we will always call it until we're dead and probably beyond. We got into kind of a what am I trying to think here? We went from just because the game is futuristic, and then we got more into the fantasy aspect at a certain point. And we talked about it the last time with the elemental shards and a council of immortals and all these different weird things. For all intents and purposes, they could kind of be like summons in a way, and different things like that. And then I would even say, with Marty's GMing style, you could directly relate some of the bad guys or some of the people that he would throw in our path as parallels in some ways to two characters.
Tons of that. I'm not afraid to admit it.
Oh, I know.
Final Fantasies 2 and 3 heavily influenced the early years of the game. And
that's an understatement. Floating continent.
Concept.
That's
sorry, I didn't catch that.
He said floating.
So that's an understatement, and I said floating continent.
Yeah, that's okay. But it's still fun to kind of play out. And then again, there was a few more characters that were influenced by VII, but that wasn't nearly as pronounced in the later years. But I don't want to talk too much about game influences from Final Fantasy, because most of that stuff's
copyright infringement.
Yeah. Yeah, no denying. It had a good 10 years of worth of influence on my tabletop RPG.
That's absolutely. The way we play games, the way we run games. I would say that I'm definitely guilty of it as well. When I took over the game for a little while, and again, this is for people who play the game, but I'm just going to throw it out there: the Emperor of the Zenith Empire. Essentially, he was Kefka for me. Like, that's kind of the way I saw him. Like, he was, that's just who he was. And when he died, it was glorious.
It was definitely correct.
Yeah. When he got offed in the game, it was, even though like it just didn't matter, it was glorious because I hate Kefka so much. Like I would say Sephiroth is an awesome bad guy, although you hate him as well at a certain point, but you almost feel sad for him at a certain point as well. But Kefka, you just hate him from the very beginning. From the first time you see, or should I say, after you see him the first time, you hate him. And and it is so satisfying to finally take him down in that game. So well done, creators of Final Fantasy III US, a.k.a. Final Fantasy VI.
And to talk about Sephiroth briefly, I don't really know how I like to rate him, because a lot of the fanboys out there almost think he gets a little too much fan service, and they tend to think of Kefka as the better villain if you were to rank the top villains in Final
It's
Fantasy.
because he had cinematics. That's what it comes down to. Like with the games when we were kids, it was all text. You had to use your imagination, and that's something that to this day we still have. And I mean, thank God. I honestly thank God we grew up in that time because we didn't get everything spoon fed to us.
Yeah. I also think when you get by the time you get to Sephiroth in the series, he is the first sexy villain, for lack of a way to explain it.
Whoa.
He is very much he's only a few story points away from being an anti-hero, to where you can go, okay, I know why he's doing what he's doing, and he's not just purely evil. So it's like I can kind of side with him. Whereas you have characters like Kefka, no. The instant he's on your screen the first time, there's nothing that man does that you want anything to do with. That little ant of a emperor you want dead from when we see him. Whereas Sephiroth, there's always this, you're not 100% for sure if you totally disagree with what he's doing. Even though he's attempting to destroy the entire planet. But you're like, well, it's because it's his mom. It's like, until that last little turn of the story arc, it's not really, Sephiroth is always just kind of out of the frame when you're dealing with the weapons.
He's kind of the
Sephiroth
boogeyman.
is there. Yeah, he's not the main guy until that last bit of the game. Whereas in a 3, it's always Kefka. In 9, it's always it's always the enemy's set from the start. By the time you get to the end, it's still the same enemy. Whereas in 7, it's Shinra for so much of that.
Yeah, you're right.
And that because of Shinra, Sephiroth comes out of that. But it's not Sephiroth, it's Shinra. And you're trying to stop Shinra from doing stuff. But then you find out, because of what Shinra has done, now they produced Sephiroth, who's now trying to do something even worse. But by the time you get to that, you already had to stop Shinra. So you've already gone through this massive villain.
And the weapons.
And then you get to Sephiroth.
You don't necessarily have to defeat them all.
You don't have to, but yeah.
A couple of them go down.
That are more in your face.
Yeah.
Whereas every time you go into Sephiroth, it's like, oh, here's a scripted fight that you feel that you have control of, but you don't. You can't beat him. It's a story arc.
Right.
I know they're all like, Kefka's the same way, but it's every time you see him, though, it's that back and forth talking, and he disappears, and it's like, oh, we got to take out the ruby weapon. Oh, we got to go over here and stop the Wu-Tai. So there's just a lot of other stuff in that game because it's so massive. Whereas 3, 9, 11, 4, you're always headed towards the same enemy that you're trying to stop. That enemy may be doing something different from the game, but 7 is that one that just all of a sudden is like, oh, Sephiroth is kind of a victim of Shinra as well. And then all of a sudden you're like, all right. And you find out that he's been playing his own game over here that you don't get to play or see. And now he's gotten to the point where he's become the villain of your game, and you're kind of the villain of his game, both trying to do the same thing and stop Genova.
Speaking of scripted battles, really quick, I just want to point out there, in Final Fantasy 3/6...
I was going to bring this up. I already know where we're going.
Yeah. When it comes to Kefka, scripted battles, I can honestly say I had Kefka's dead animation twice. Once in the Imperial camp, you hit him with an orbital, down, dead. Like actually laying down on the ground, dead. In front of the sealed cave, cast Doom, Grim Reaper pulls the soul away, bam, dead. And again, we want to talk about game screwovers. Pops right back up.
Yep.
Right. Well, there's actually one of the point in the game in the fights where you have to kill him because then he jumps back up and laughs at you and runs off. It's like,
well, that was one of those battles. But I'm telling you, you can either hit him.
That might be the military camp. Yeah.
You hit him once and he runs away. But I'm telling you, you hit him with an ore bolt, he is flat dead.
Well, and you do have a way of taking out bosses before they're supposed to be taken out, knowing that they're going to come back in the next scene, i.e. the TIE Fighter Flight Simulator.
Yeah, I could have prevented the entire TIE Fighter expansion.
You could have exactly.
I remember TIE Fighter in Final Fantasy.
Stop. kind of to close this out, I would say Final Fantasy is one of those titles that you do not have to play a single one of them to enjoy a single one of them. what I'm saying is you don't have to pay it. You could play 15 and enjoy it. It's its own story. It's always its own story. The only exceptions to that are X and X2, as well as 13, and I think there's 13, 2, and 3. And, that's okay. Like, even those, you could play them independently from each other. They are each individual games that have their own story that is unrelated to the other games. So I would recommend if you've never played one, there's a lot of good starts you can get. I mean, Final Fantasy VII Remake, that might be a good start because it's something brand new. If you're used to the new style of platforms, might be something better. But if you want to get into something old school, I mean, you can jump into any one of them. There's downloads for them. There's emulators for them. I mean, they're out there a million times over. So I would recommend playing any of them, spend some time with it, enjoy, and just like immerse yourself in that game because they are fantastic. Most of them are, except for 8. Anybody else got anything to close with as far as that goes?
No, I mean, as far as the Final Fantasy franchise, I mean, everybody's got their favorites. Tactics is still mine. It was because playing through that job class system reminded me of going through a college curriculum. In order to get your degree in this class, you had to meet these requirements. Overall, it's been a well-done series. It's definitely a staple of gaming. And, if you didn't like one Final Fantasy, I wouldn't write off the entire franchise. Try another and see if it's a little bit different. So that's just kind of my personal take.
Yeah, I know we say it multiple times, but I think if you enjoy an RPG that isn't overly Japanese, and when I say that, you'll have stuff like Persona that has so much and it's tied into Japanese culture, which today is easier to get into than it was, early 90s, just because of now access from internet. But just a series that just is fantasy based. They don't make a lot of cultural references, so you can get into it without having to know specific things about the culture that created the game. There's so many of them out there that I think you can find one and jump into it. Whether you want to go old school and go turn-based with a little bit slower, more thought-out combat, which is the ones I prefer, or if you're into the Devil May Cry, God of War style action, Final Fantasy 15 and even 7 Remake will do that. Gives you that, faster paced combat to where, it keeps you more involved in it instead of being a chess game in combat. It is a video game in the combat. So I just think there's enough out there for anyone that wants to look for a really well told story that you can get into that branches in all kinds of different directions, where most of them you can play it 6 different times, and 80% of the games can be the same, but the other 20% can be different every time. And you may find something in the second playthrough that you didn't even know was there in the first playthrough, and do the same thing 6th playthrough. All of a sudden, it's like, wow, I didn't realize if I went in there with this group of characters, something completely different happens. So,
one quick question, guys, before we close this out. In terms of overall Final Fantasy story, which is your favorite? Which is kind of like the one that has you scratching your head? So what would be your favorite that you've seen over the years? And then which one kind of has you scratching your head the most?
So story-wise, I would put that on 7. For the very same reason I explained with Sephiroth. Because you start off and your characters are doing one thing. And as they're doing that, the world is changing around them, and they don't really deal with that right off the bat. But then they get drawn into all these changes, so it's not, they did A, B, and C, and because of that, now they have to go do D. No, they do A, B, and C, but because they're doing that, the villain is off over here doing something completely and utterly different that you have nothing to affect because you're not over there, and then all of a sudden you intersect that, and then you have to deal with that outcome. And then you kind of think you're winning, and all of a sudden you discover, yay, we're stopping oh crap, there's Sephiroth now, we've not done anything about, and now he is power creeped up above us, and now we have to deal with him. I think 7 does a really good job of that. That would be my one for the best story.
Yeah, I would agree with you on 7 being the best overall story, just because, I mean, it goes topsy-turvy a couple of times, and the story becomes big, then it becomes small again, then it becomes big, then it becomes small, and then obviously it crescendos into the finale where you are saving the entire planet and then some, really. As far as the I think you're kind of saying like the worst storyline or the weirdest kind of storyline, pretty much I'd probably put that on 13 because I didn't personally play that, but I watched my wife play that quite a bit, and it's one of those games where she beat the game, and I forgot how many hours she put in, but she beat it officially. And then the game keeps going, which makes absolutely no sense. And I mean, it keeps going and going and going. So you don't even get your best weapons until 30 hours. I mean, I might be making numbers up, but like 30 hours of gameplay after you've beat the game. That makes no sense to me. That's the scratching my head one where, I mean, the story wasn't bad. It just didn't make sense why it continued afterwards. It's not Pokemon, you know? Like, Final Fantasy should have an ending, in my opinion. What about you, Marty?
Okay, as far as good stories, I mean, I really enjoyed the stories of 2, 3, 7, obviously. And I don't want to give Tactics too much love, but I really do love the story of Tactics.
So Jeff has an unhealthy relationship with Final Fantasy Tactics. I think we need to have an intervention.
I can quit anytime I want to. But
You really want to?
In terms of kind of what, to this very day, you guys might laugh at me for this, especially you, Matt. To this very day, now I've gone on the internet, I've watched videos about it, I've read articles. I still don't understand the main plot points of the villains of the original Final Fantasy. The whole time loop thing.
It doesn't make sense.
To this very day, I cannot figure it out.
Garland is chaos, but since you beat chaos, Garland was never beat, and Garland, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, what the heck?
Right. I've never gotten it. So maybe we'll get a comment someday that explains it to me.
Yes, that's what we want right now. So leave a comment about what the heck that ending was and what that actually means. Because I don't have a master's in physics or a doctorate in physics to explain it. I need to know. That's just my thought on it. So in closing, does anybody have any plugs? Jeff, do you want to plug your channel?
Actually, I will in this case, because I have actually done a review on Final Fantasy VII Remake.
Oh, hilarious. Go ahead.
Yeah, check out Mad Respect TV. Look for Casual Gamers review of Final Fantasy VII Remake. I know I do use a little too much rehashed footage, but I was not going back to my PlayStation to record more that night.
What platform is that on?
It's on YouTube.
All right.
So, Final Fantasy VII Remake under Mad Respect TV.
Radis, what do you got? Anything?
Nope, nothing.
You're like, nothing. I just go to work.
Tossing around the idea of starting a YouTube channel, but if I do anything, I think I'm going to stick with podcasts. I think audio is the route I want to stay. So right now, it's just this channel.
All right. So he's plugging the channel. Very good.
Yep.
I'm going to throw a couple of plugs out there. Retro on pretty much every kind of podcast platform that you want to go to. That's our friend Raven J. Obviously, he does retro topics. And then also Saturday Night Freak Show. It's run by a gentleman named Colin, where they review, in general, it's horror movies, vintage and sooner. Definitely a good group of people. Film critics for sure. So, you know, they may say some things that kind of change what you believe in the movies that you've watched in the past and or are going to watch. Let's say goodnight, Radis, and let's say goodnight, Marty.
Take it easy. Peace out. Peace.
And you all take care.
I'm waving, but we're waving.
Yep. Be safe. God bless. And this has been the Game Files Podcast.